How did you emerge from the darkness? Hi, my name is I Am McCullum, and in this podcast, Tales of the Stardust, I will be telling you stories from antiquity and world mythology, but in a different light and different perspective, with stories that you can incorporate in your everyday life, because these stories have been told from generations to generations, and there must be some meaning to them. So come and join me as we dive deep down in today's story. In the first episode of this podcast, I talked about Persephone and Demeter, but I told the abduction of Persephone through Demeter's eyes. But in this episode, I'm going to talk about how Persephone dealt with being kidnapped and brought into the underworld and was being forced to marry the Lord of the Underworld, Hades, and become the queen of the underworld. But how she really took that in and really did emerge out of the underworld as a queen, more or less than the girl that she was taken from. So here's the story of the abduction of Persephone through Persephone's eyes, and how this is the first myth I ever read of Greek mythology, and it really does stand the test of time for me because it's a classic story, but it has so many lessons that just makes the story so rich and beautiful, because we see it through a mother's perspective, but seeing it through the child's perspective of going into this dark, dreary place as known as adulthood and coming back triumphantly back into the world that we saw as a kid, but we see it stronger. Because in the beginning of the myth, Persephone is known as a child. She's innocent. She has no bad things to her name. And surprisingly, she's the only goddess on Olympus that is a descendant from Zeus that is not classified as a virgin goddess, like Athena and Artemis. And this is because what we talked about in this series is that virgin goddesses rely on themselves. Persephone did not rely on herself. She relied on her mother most of the time. And that bond with her mother was so keen that I said in the first episode, they were inseparable. They could not be separated apart, mainly because her mother was so clingy to her. But it happened when it was around that time when she came of age and she was playing around with some nymphs and she wanted some solitude, some place to get away, that she wandered off into the woods alone. And while she was alone, she was kidnapped by Hades because she wasn't paying attention, and she was brought into the underworld. In some version of this myth, she's looking at a narcissus flower. So she's kind of a little, I would like to say, ditzy. She was distracted. She was distracted when she was kidnapped. Because if we think about it, it will be pretty hard to kidnap Athena or Artemis as a wife, but it makes Persephone an easy target because she relied on her mother for protection, and she kind of forgot that it's not really safe to be a goddess all alone in the woods. Like most children, they're not aware of dangers. Parents would like to keep their children away from the horrors and scorns of the world, because in the world of Greek mythology, Persephone wasn't taking into the fact that sometimes a goddess alone in the woods, of stories of nymphs getting seduced by other gods and whatever man is strolling by. And Persephone kind of doesn't really think about this fact until it kind of happens to her. So when Persephone is taken down to the underworld, right off the bat, she's scared and confused. And worst of all, she finds out that this was all planned by Zeus and Hades so that she could be taken without interference of her mother. This was all because of her mother not wanting her to get married in the first place. Not that she wanted to get married necessarily, but that this was never her decision in the first place, and that her family was deciding her fate for her. When we choose to grow up and we face our own underworld, it can be the same way. We are frightened and random people, and sometimes we feel that the universe just cuts out our lives for us and that we can't control it. And we get mad and we get frustrated. And the problem is then we're stuck in this underworld that we have no idea what it is, but it's just terrible. So then, what does Persephone do? She's in this terrible place. She has to face the truth of her own reality. And most of all, she now has a responsibility that she never had before. Now she's a queen of the underworld. What I like to think of it is this is a story about growing up. In the first episode, we talked about letting go, but in Persephone's eyes, this is a chance to grow up. And we think of growing up as a bad thing, of losing our fantasies. But Persephone does something else. She takes control. She takes that title of that queen necessarily. And we think of it as going to college in like the first episode. Yes, it's really sad for the parents to see the kid go, but then we forget about the kid's perspective. And we think of it as a scary place where our parents send us sometimes and where they can't reach us. And most of the time we think, and since we're young and kind of a little ignorant, sometimes we think that the universe just kind of ties down for us and that it's always super hard and that Starbucks is more expensive and we have rent to pay and we have to do laundry. The room doesn't magically get clean all of a sudden. All these adult things just happen and now we're stuck in our own underworld by ourselves. But what Persephone does is that she takes control of this underworld. She becomes the queen of the underworld. She becomes the queen of her own destiny, per se. Who also helps Persephone is a goddess named Hecate, who's the goddess of witchcraft. And Hecate serves her as a mentor, a sort of friend. And I believe growing up can be scary. Growing up and facing adulthood is scary, because we have to face realities. But when we have friends and when we have someone that's older that has experience, being there side by side and having them guide you through all your troubles helps you cope and helps you adapt to your new surroundings. And that's really what Persephone is. She adapts and she takes control of what she is. And she doesn't come back a little kid to her mother. She has to go back to the underworld because she did eat those pomegranate seeds, or she was tricked into eating those pomegranate seeds, but also that she has a responsibility to the underworld as her kingdom. And I prefer to think of it like that instead of thinking it as winter, because when we get older, we start getting more responsibilities. And the responsibilities that we take on makes us feel more important, that makes us feel more. And that when we have that responsibility and that we go back to it, then we could come back out of that underworld that we were in and come out a queen. So what are you going to come out as? Thank you so much for listening to Tales of the Stardust. If you'd like to hear more content like this, be sure to follow me on Instagram and Twitter at @im_McCullum. And as always, let the stars be your guide.